The process of making comics is a lot more complicated than meets the eye. Like, a lot. There are many things to be cognizant of, like the use of backgrounds, the placement of word balloons, and coloring where applicable, all of which I covered in a video last year detailing some of the things I learned in art school. But another very important piece of the puzzle that I feel warrants its own video, and one piece that I covered in that original video that I want to expand on, is the art of storytelling in comics. I'm not necessarily talking about the script writing, even though that's another crucial piece of the comic puzzle and something that in my opinion also warrants its own video. I'm talking about things such as the use of camera angles, poses, composition, and expressions. If you want to accurately convey the vision for your story that you've set up in your head and in your script, then it's important to understand what goes into the whimsical little thing called visual storytelling. I've expressed this sentiment several times on the channel before, but I feel like I only got good at the art of cartooning after I graduated from art school. There were many aspects of comic making that I was weaker in at the time. Though, to be fair, that is to be expected when comparing your older stuff to what you can create now. However, looking back, I feel like the aspect of cartooning that I was the weakest at was storytelling. Yes, I had ideas for stories, and I did have some vision of how I was going to convey those ideas, but unfortunately I just didn't push myself as hard as I could have in the narrative department. And as a result, the finished product declined into a kind of state of stagnation. Take, for example, my unwillingness to experiment with camera angles and composition, both of which I'll be covering in this video, as well as college me's inability to allow the visuals to stand on their own without having to rely on the script. Lest we forget the advice I got from my storytelling teacher. This story must rely heavily on the dialogue because I don't get it. But as with tips that I learned with making comics in general, I also learned a number of important tips for storytelling specifically, and this is something that I want to share with the people of the internet, as storytelling is a critical part of the comic process that shouldn't be overlooked. So I guess you can call this a sort of follow-up to that OG video. I wonder if I should make this a series. I'll be using my own examples as with the last video, but unlike the last video, these things that I'm going to talk about can pertain to both the traditional comic structure and the vertical format, as the rules of visual storytelling apply in both of these scenarios. But anyhow, if you're new here and you want to learn about or better understand the many facets of comic storytelling and what you can do to improve, then make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, then welcome back to the spaghetti layer. Either way, strap your butts in, because here we go! Let's start things off with camera angles. Okay, I may not be talking about literal camera angles here, since you won't need a camera to film your scenes the way you would a movie, even though there's a pretty good chance you'll need it for photo reference. However, a similar concept applies when it comes to comics, as being a comic artist also entails being a proverbial director/cinematographer, along with being the one who draws the pages. You may include your intended camera angles in your comic script as I do, or you may embrace chaos and save it for the storyboards. Regardless of how you approach your camera angles, it's always good to plot them out at some point in the comic making process to ensure that a scene reads clearly and captures the intended tone/mood. But what kinds of camera angles are we talking about when it comes to comics? Well, there are multiple camera angles that you have at your disposal. Let's start with the proverbial smaller stuff and then work our way outward into, anyway, you can ignore that. Of course, these aren't all of the camera angles you can explore, but these are the more important ones to be aware of. Let's start with the close shots and the extreme close-ups. These are typically used to place an emphasis on specific actions or to show the significance of a single moment in the story. And they can also be used to emphasize important moments, such as a character's reaction to something that they were probably better off not seeing. Close-ups can also allow for visual and emotional intimacy with a character, and if a character is feeling particularly strong emotions, then a close-up can allow the reader to get a better understanding of what the character is feeling. Mid-range shots typically go down to a character's waist, and they're a good middle ground for when you want the reader to focus on a subject, but you don't want to exaggerate or emphasize anything in particular. Conversations between characters may often utilize this camera angle. Wide shots, one of my many nemeses, capture a greater scope of what's going on in the scene, often far beyond the characters themselves. This camera angle can capture things like setting indicators and also creates and defines a sense of space within the panel. It also takes the reader out of a character's personal space and gives the setting a realistic feel to it. Establishing shots, or panels that are usually placed at the beginning of each new scene, also fall into the wide shot umbrella, since their primary function is to convey as much information regarding the setting as possible to allow the reader to understand where the scene is taking place. While all of these camera angles provide valuable information in their own way, it's important to keep from getting too repetitive with your camera angles. For example, under most circumstances, you shouldn't have all of your panels be mid-range shots for multiple pages at a time, something that I was very much guilty of for years. This lack of variety can and often does get stagnant pretty quickly, but there are some exceptions to this rule where you can get away with this sort of thing. If you want to place emphasis on a very specific moment in the story, want the scene to slow down in time for a bit, or want the reader to focus on a small details being things like a character looking at one thing and then shifting focus to something else, or a character moving their hand someplace else, then it's okay to have 2 or 3 panels feature the same subject. You can also have the proverbial camera zoom in or out on a certain focal point over the course of several panels, depending on the circumstance. Outside of that, though, try varying your camera angles and see what works best, provided that they fit the narrative and your intended vision for the story. Because while you shouldn't get too repetitive under most circumstances, you shouldn't have wide shots for the sake of having wide shots either. Regardless of how you handle your camera angles, each camera angle should feel intentional. Poses. Who doesn't love drawing them? You've most likely struck a dramatic, super epic pose at least once in your life. You've probably also made goofy faces in the mirror or to other people at least once. I know I have. You may also know how important body language can be. All 3 of these things have one thing in common. They all play an important part in visual storytelling. Much like how it would be in, let's say, a movie or TV show, a character's body language or expressions convey how they're feeling in that particular moment, whether it's happiness, sadness, anger, confusion, or something else. Similarly, facial expressions can go a long way when it comes to emotions. After all, you wouldn't want your character screaming angrily into the void while making a deadpan expression. Although that would probably work for comedic effect. As I said in the OG video, if a character is feeling strong emotions, let it show on their face. But to depart from emotions for a bit, you should also show the character performing whatever actions you've intended for them in the scripts or the storyboards, whether that's cooking or fighting someone over the daily spaghetti rations. For example, you should let the reader see just what it is your character is making, or who your character has gotten into a fistfight with. Are they dodging their opponent's attacks, or actively trying to go on the offense themselves? Okay, I am saying this because I've seen people just put the actions in asterisks in the word balloons, but I really do think it's beneficial to draw those actions in the panels. Now, this is one of many things that I've historically struggled with, but try not to have your poses be too stiff. In other words, don't have them looking like those ball-jointed drawing mannequins that a lot of artists throw shade on. And they're not very flexible anyway, to be honest. Something like this simple kick is fine and can work depending on the context. But you can also try giving your character a more dynamic pose if you really want to illustrate and emphasize the action taking place. I don't know, hopefully I'm making sense. Similarly, don't have them just stand there doing absolutely nothing, hands at their sides and straighter than a board the entire scene. Unless, again, they're a deadpan sort of character, then that's fine too. They should be posed in a way that suits their current emotion and their current actions. You can also do this in accordance with their personality, but you can also have them act in a way that is very different from how they present themselves depending on the circumstances. For example, a normally calm character finally losing their cool. But how do you get your characters to not look so stiff? The most important thing to use is reference, whether that's photo reference or 3D models. For example, you can look up stock poses or find websites that have a bunch of 3D models that you can use. For me, the 3D models in Clip Studio Paint and the Pose Maniacs website both come to mind. And if you use CSP, you can actually use the latter to upload their models onto your canvas. Great website, by the way. Please sponsor me. Think about the placement of the limbs and the joints, the general flow of the gesture, how you can keep it from being too stiff, things like that. However, having said that, can you get away with completely drawing out of your head? Probably. But because your poses need to at least look believable in the finished product, you would need a certain level of skill and need to know what you're doing before you attempt something like this. But that's just my opinion. And it's also funny that we're talking about body language and expressions here, because in a way this also ties in with... Okay, so The Thing. Why am I calling it The Thing? This is something that I discussed briefly in the general comic making process video, but since we're talking about storytelling at length, and also because I'm on a mission to save the masses from making the mistakes that I did in my youth, I think now is as good a time as any to bring it up again in more detail. The relationship between your comic panels and your script is very important in regards to storytelling. In an ideal scenario, you want the story of your comic to shine through and be legible to the reader without having to rely on the script. In other words, if you were to remove the word balloons entirely from your comic, the audience should have at least some understanding of what's going on. And if you're making a silent comic, or a comic with no dialogue or captions at all, then this is pretty much a requirement anyway. If the storytelling in your comic relies too much on the script itself, and you don't let the illustrations carry that weight, you risk sacrificing the legibility of the storytelling taking place in the artwork itself. Yes, script and dialogue both play an important role in comics, but keep in mind that the artwork is another big cornerstone of the process and part of what makes comics comics in the first place. To see some differing examples side by side, let's have a look at some of my older work and put it side by side with some more recent work. First, let's look at a comic that I made during my second year of college. This was supposed to be a prequel piece to a story that I'd had in mind, but scrapped later on, and it featured the two main characters, April and December, having a debate about what they believed in and what was important to them. And yes, I named them both after months. While in the beginning you can get the sense that they're talking about and bickering over something if you were to remove the speech bubbles, and there is a flashback in the middle where April expresses her desire to follow in her parents' footsteps that I think is executed decently in regards to storytelling, at least for the time it was made, it falls flat in the last few pages. When their argument comes to a head, December decides to end the argument by walking away from and disregarding his older sister, something that annoys April greatly. Even though she's dejected by having been shut down, she's determined to show her brother that there is more to life than what he thinks there is. But there's a problem. The only thing that shows what and how she's feeling in that moment is expressed only by an uptick of a smile on her face in the last panel, and another panel where she's looking on at her brother in annoyance. Looking back, and also to go back to body language, I think this scene could have benefited from April being seen hunching her shoulders, looking down in defeat, and maybe balling her fists at first. But maybe she could raise her head afterwards and have that uptick of a smile on her face at the end. We know how April is feeling based on her inner dialogue, but on the panel she seems very emotionless. Quite unlike someone who wears her emotions on her sleeve and who's just been shut out during a debate over something she's very passionate about. I think those kinds of changes could have greatly improved the storytelling and the reading experience here. Next, I want to look at a comic I've talked about on the channel before, a 10-page comic called Heliotrope. Also meant to be a prequel to a story idea that I had at the time. The comic follows the main character Emily being paid a visit by her friend Anik and being told that she's a critical piece in stopping a potential world-ending plot. There are some flashes of decency here, again by the standards of 2016 me, but the vast majority of the comic falls flat in its storytelling. These two characters, Gray and Theo, are calling each other about Emily's role in their mission. Gray is a little put off by how Theo chooses to word things, but you don't really see that from his or Theo's expressions or body language. And they just look like they're having a regular conversation. Then in this flashback, we as the reader learn the potential of Emily's ability, the ability to manipulate colors, and her ties to the group that the other characters are a part of. We get a group shot of Emily's old teammates, but as my storytelling professor in college put it seems more like Emily is just meeting up with some friends. And not only that, after we see Emily and Anik talk about the former's newest painting, they're never seen in the comic again. The reason I began remaking Heliotrope was because I wanted to improve just about everything from the original version, and that included the storytelling. I still need to finish the remake, but I want to showcase the pages that are finished. The remake opens with Emily hard at work on her newest painting when Anik arrives at her apartment. While in the original we get some indication that Anik wants to break some kind of news to Emily, in the remake we can more easily see that Anik has been flustered by the circumstances of her very unexpected arrival. Outside, Gray and Theo talk about Emily's importance and her role in their mission. Where their original conversation just seemed like an ordinary phone call if you were to remove the dialogue, we can see from Gray's expression in the remake that he wants nothing to do with this. And at one point we can see that he gets somewhat offended by a passing comment that Theo makes. When we cut back to Emily's apartment and learn just why Anik wants to speak to her, Emily reminisces about what happened the last time she participated in a mission with the rest of the team. I wanted to imply just how bad Emily's last mission was and how it still affected her by the events of the comic, so I made sure to have the background in this panel be an allusion to that. And I made sure to have Emily's facial expression show the kinds of emotions she was feeling in that moment. I still have some ways to go on this front, but I like to think that I improved. One more newer example that I want to showcase is from the opening pages of my current webcomic project, The Reverent Silence. For anyone wondering, the rest of Chapter 1 is coming along. And no, we are not talking about the fact that I had to remake a whole fight scene. The story opens with a group of officers from the Blackfeld Investigation Bureau doing a round of patrolling when Maddock, the wolf dude in the cloak, makes a move to ambush them. He briefly gets distracted by the small talk his targets are making, and laments the fact that he'd rather be somewhere else, as evidenced by his exhale, posture, and the pained expression, but quickly shifts his focus back to his objective. Later on we see Maddock preparing to make a move. Some of his aura pulls in his hand and sizzles as it hits the cobblestones, indicating the corrosive nature of his power. And in the first few panels you can also see one character wrapping his wings around himself to shield himself from the cold, which he also makes a comment on and shows visible exasperation over. While, again, all of this correlates to body language and expressions in its own way, it also ties back to the relationship between the artwork and the script. Even without the script, the reader should have an idea of the intended narrative and plot/story progression. There are two more things that I want to cover in today's video, but before I get to that, let's cut to a super special commercial break. You there. Yes, you. Do you want to begin writing a new story or want to give an existing idea a new coat of paint, but don't know where to start? Don't worry, breaking free of your writer's block is just one click away with Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes on topics that include illustration, design, photography, video, and more. These classes are taught by folks who represent the top of their creative disciplines, so you can level up in your creative journey worry-free. You'll also get curated sequences of classes to guide you towards your goals, an active community of fellow creators to give you feedback, and certificates and badges to help you celebrate your accomplishments. If you want to get inspired, learn new skills, and make new creative discoveries, look no further than Skillshare. But what kinds of classes can you expect to find on the platform? Well, as some of you may already know, I'm a writer on top of being a comic artist, and while I'm not sure how much I can reveal, I've been working on a full-length novel for some time now, even if I recently had to go scorched earth on the thing because it was a hot mess. While admittedly I have been a little hung up on the new plot progression for the story, that's where this class comes in. Writing Fiction: 5 Exercises to Craft a Compelling Plot by Lisa Ko, author of the contemporary fiction novel The Leavers. Just as it says on the tin, you're given 5 different exercises relating to not only how to craft a plot for your story, but also how to develop your characters. And this class can be very useful not just for new story ideas, but also if you have an existing idea but want to refurbish it like I did. And I can feel the writer's block disappearing already. But wait, there's more! If you join Skillshare using this coupon code, you'll get your first month free. Yes, you heard that right, the first month is free. You can also get this discount by clicking on the link in the description of this video. So don't miss this special opportunity to level your skills. At a discount! Thank you to the folks at Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And speaking of the video, let's get right back to the topic. While composition in comics can also refer to the setup of each panel on the page, I want to talk about what goes into the panel itself within the context of storytelling. The panel should ideally feature one or more focal points, something of significance in that scene for the reader to focus on. That focal point, whether it's a character or an object, should be the star of the show within that panel or set of panels. If the narrative emphasis is currently on a character's feelings or emotions, then let it take up a majority of the illustrational composition. If 2 characters are conversing about the size of the universe, then maybe you can switch to showing the sky as the characters look up at it. If a character has been distracted by birdsong, then show them looking at the bird while also showing the bird in the foreground of that panel, or having it be featured in a panel of its own, as long as you indicate that the bird is in fact the source of the noise. Regardless of how you choose to go about it, something that you want to avoid in storytelling-based composition is cluttering the panels so that it's hard to tell where your characters are or where your intended focal points are in that panel. If your characters are in a heated argument that has culminated in them throwing pasta at each other, for example, then those characters should be the star of the show. If you want the reader to focus on a bouquet of flowers or something, then put more emphasis on that and try not to go overboard with the surrounding details. In this scenario, less is typically more. And since we're talking about composition, I think now is a good time to go over the 180 rule, which is also a known term in filmmaking and something that I briefly touched on in the general comic making video, but also something I wanted to bring up again. So what is the 180 rule? Basically what you need to know is that if there are 2 or more characters in a scene, then they should always stay on their designated side of the screen, or in this case panel, regardless of what camera angle you switch to as the scene progresses. Let's say that you have 2 characters in a scene named Bob and Steve. If Bob is first seen on the left side of the panel, then he should ideally stay there for the duration of that scene. Similarly, if Steve is on the right side, then he should stay there as well. If you switch the characters' positions, then the reader's understanding of where the characters are in a setting will usually be thrown off and result in a sense of confusion. Did Bob teleport off screen here? Does he have special powers that allow him and Steve to switch places? If the answer is no, then it's probably a good idea to keep them where they are. As I said in the OG video, I've heard that this rule can be broken in filmmaking under special circumstances, but I still think that it's better to avoid any mishaps. Last year I made a different video talking about 3 tricks to keep in mind when coloring digitally. One of the tricks I discussed was a thing I called atmospheric coloring, or adjusting the tone and brightness of the colors in a piece to get the atmosphere that you want. That is, if you choose to finish your piece in color instead of black and white. I also want to mention though that how you color your panels, again if you choose to have your comic be in color, can affect the mood of a given scene. Scenes that feature warmer and brighter colors might evoke a sense of happiness or lightheartedness, while scenes with darker, cooler, or more muted colors might give a more foreboding, subdued, and gloomy impression. However, you could also have the coloring be a juxtaposition to the mood of the scene. Maybe you could use brighter colors for a narratively darker scene, or a scene where absolutely everything goes wrong for your character. Conversely, you could use cooler and muted colors in a lighthearted scene. Again, it's always a good idea to experiment. This isn't just limited to color palettes themselves, though. If you want a scene to be more moody, then try having your characters be mostly cast in shadow. Well, okay, this is an older piece, but I thought it fit here. Similarly, you can achieve a similar effect in grayscale through things like shading, indication of light sources and shadows, placement of screen tones or gray tones, and blocking out the backgrounds of certain panels. And those are the things I wanted to talk about when it comes to visual storytelling in comics. I think that if I do a third video in this style, I want to tackle something like script writing or inking or storyboarding. This is something that I may put to a poll in the future, but in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, while all of these things are good to keep in mind when it comes to storytelling, you shouldn't feel obligated to follow all of these rules to a T. Try experimenting with some of these and see what works for you. As long as you don't end up confusing your readers, of course. Many of these tips are things that I'm still working on myself, but I still thought it would be good to make this sort of video. Hopefully this video taught you a few things about visual storytelling, whether you're new to making comics or have been making them for a few years and you want to strengthen your storytelling game. But anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you like this video and want to see more from me, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for upcoming art-related videos and other shenanigans. If you want to support me further, please check out my other social media accounts as well as my Ko-fi and my Etsy shop, which are all in the description. And lastly, if you made it this far, leave a pizza emoji in the comment section below. And remember to keep things civil in the comments, or I will put a whoopee cushion in your chair when you least expect it. And yeah, that's about everything. Thanks for watching.